Um, what, what I thought I might do is first of all explain a bit where I come from, and then maybe just 3 or 4 sort of nuggets of things which may be of interest and may spark then question or disagreement or whatever. So, as Mihaela said, my career is a mixture of sort of 2 opposite things. So some jobs I've had sitting at the top of governments, here in the UK, in charge of policy for prime ministers, and working quite a bit around the world, often with prime ministers and presidents, on sort of central structures, looking down, and the other half doing the opposite, as involved in community projects, social enterprises, and so on, from the grassroots up. So I kind of see the world in these opposite ways. Both sides hate each other, and so I have these sort of 2 opposites within my brain, the top down and the bottom up.
Partnership.
Yeah, and I now have the very nice job. I run a thing called, which is the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts here in the UK. It's not a think tank, we actually a foundation with money, which is quite nice, and working a lot around the world, from, in fact, Malaysia, we're just starting quite a bit of work, Brazil, China, India. We did a big study a couple of weeks ago on the Chinese innovation system, which might be of interest to some of you. So just a few very brief sort of thoughts on sort of CPTM, Smart Partnership territory. The first is really about strategy. So I was asked by Tony Blair to try and create a structure to do strategy. And in a way, our task was incredibly simple, but incredibly difficult. And in a way, it's still, I think, the hardest thing for a government is to know what exactly you're trying to achieve and how are you going to achieve it. I still spend a lot of time working with governments trying to get that precision on what really matters, what matters now, medium term, long term, and what does that require in terms of people, money, structures. In that, I learned again and again the basic mistakes which we repeatedly made in Britain, but I also see around the world. The most elementary one was thinking that a big fat paper document was a strategy. And all over the world, governments produce things called strategies, which are very detailed and very long, and nobody reads and have no impact on anything. So often the very best strategy never has a paper form. And yet many consultancies do very well producing these documents, and I see one of my roles is to put them out of business, and that's another matter. Secondly, we repeatedly found strategies being developed where no one in the room actually had any real frontline knowledge of the thing being talked about. And one of my depressing experiences still around the world is how many governments, their key decisions are made with literally no one there who knows how this will actually work, literally on the ground in a farm or a school or a prison and so on. So we tried at these basic principles, how do you do strategy which taps kind of frontline knowledge. Just as important, within any government, however clever the politicians, however clever the civil servants, there will always be more brain power outside than inside. So how do you tap into that brain power to help you frame your issues, frame your ideas, and so on? And we're at the moment doing quite a lot of work on new technological tools for tapping collective intelligence, experts, etc., in decision-making processes. And I'm at the moment very excited that now all sorts of things are possible which weren't actually possible 10 years ago on that front. Anyway, lots more to be said about that, and as you said, Mihaela, we did a lot of experimentation on how you create, in a sense, just a sharper link between the high-level goals of, let's say, raising educational standards, your targets, your metrics, your teacher training, and finding out what was actually happening. And then, when it turned out your policy was wrong, how do you quickly change it, rather than, as most governments do, pretend it's still working, even when you know it's not working. So I'd be interested to talk more about all of that. But one of the biggest things I learned doing strategy was that there was quite a limit to how much we could do top-down, even the very best strategy. And a lot of what I've been working on more recently is almost the opposite. How can a government stimulate experimentation, innovation on the ground, which can then help you change your strategy and make it smarter? And some of this we've done directly through Nesta. Most recently, we've been working with Michael Bloomberg, who stepped down yesterday, for Mayor of New York, looking at what we call the I-teams, the innovation teams within national governments and city governments, where there's a unit set up not to design a strategy, but to stimulate essentially creativity and experiment on the things which matter most to the political leaders. Bloomberg did this very well in New York on things like economic opportunity for young people. And we've been looking at teams in many countries, Korea, Malaysia. I was in Colombia 2 weeks ago, which has got some very interesting things going on. And usually, these teams operate in an almost opposite way to traditional bureaucratic structures. They operate very fast. Some of the ones in the US at the moment try to get from an idea to a first implementation within 6 weeks, which is unthinkable in most governments. And so they try things often very small, but very fast. But it has to be in a real-life environment to see if it works. They're nearly all very data-driven. They try and quickly measure if their idea works or not. And they have a sort of, and they're nearly all made up half of civil servants and half people brought in from outside. Business entrepreneurs, technologists, and so on. So two very different examples, just to give you a flavor of this. In Korea, the innovation team in Seoul has been working on an extraordinary range of projects, but one of them is simply creating car-sharing platforms. So the citizens of Seoul don't all have to buy a car, they can use the internet to share their cars in intelligent ways. And it's spread right across the city, very, very fast, very low cost, and of course frees up a lot of spending power for the citizens of Seoul. The other one, which is also car-related, is slightly mad, but I'll tell you about it anyway. It's in the city of Boston, where they've developed an app which people can download onto their phone, and this then spots if you're in a car and you drive over a hole in the road, because the phone goes like that, and it sends the data to City Hall, which then knows where to send people to fix the road. You know, both of these are interesting because they mobilize citizen power, citizen input to save money for the bureaucracy. And there are hundreds of examples of this kind of this new spirit of innovation. And a lot of the work we're doing at Nesta with the UNDP and others is spreading these innovation methods around the world, because on every topic which matters, as I said, however clever the people in the government, if you can mobilize lots of experiment and innovation around you, you get better ideas to inform your policy. The third thing, though, to mention is, of course, it only makes sense to do experimentation if you have some way of knowing what works, what then deserves to be taken into policy and programs. And most experiments fail, or even if they look quite good, you know, like the street bump one may look quite promising, but it may end up sending you far too many signals. There's too many bumps in the road. So we've been working a lot in the last 2 years on evidence. How do we get evidence more effectively into policy? And this may not, I don't know how relevant this will be to you. We've created, I think, the Alliance for Useful Evidence, which now has 1,500 organizations in it, in the UK, all the ones creating evidence on what works in policing, in local economic growth, in caring for the elderly. And we've persuaded the government now to create a network of what works centres, there's 6 initially, to act as really semi-independent places which will provide information to a police chief or a head teacher or a policy maker or a city on what works and what doesn't. This shouldn't be necessary at all. It should be easy to find out what works, but when we've actually interviewed the people responsible for almost every area of public policy and delivery here in the UK, they simply don't know what works. They don't know what the evidence is. So they often try things which have been proven not to work, although they sounded good. Or they'll be in a neighbouring town, something incredibly good and they haven't heard of it. So even in the age of Google searches, it's amazing how inefficient our basic systems are for knowledge and for helping people adopt someone else's really good idea. And I'm ever more convinced this age belongs to the people who are shameless about stealing other people's good ideas. And indeed, Steve Jobs, who's often presented as a brilliant creative innovator, and in some ways he was, in reality was much better at stealing other people's ideas and putting them together well. Every single element of the iPod he took from someone else. But that's a good thing to do, not a bad thing. So, interested in your thoughts on evidence and how we make that part of the daily life of everyone, every level of an administration. So it's just as a matter of course, you are aware of what is known worldwide about what to do, what works and what doesn't. Should be obvious, but isn't. So, last couple of minutes on the locust and the bee, which you introduced me in relation to. This is a book which...
Who is a locust?
This is the big question. We all have to choose whether to be locusts or bees. So this book originated, came out this year. It's published by Princeton University Press. And it was my attempt to make sense of the economic crisis, what had caused it, but much more importantly, how we could get out of it. How could we avoid repeating the errors of the 2000s, which have destroyed so much value across the world. And in a nutshell, I actually went back to Adam Smith, English economist of 250 years ago. And Adam Smith is thought of as the great advocate of the free market, and he was, but he was much subtler than that. He showed that in every real market, there will be incentives for business people to make really useful things for people, to sell them to them and make a profit, but there are also very strong incentives for them to rip people off, to take advantage of people, to be predators. And it's in the nature of every market that you will get both the creators and the predators, both the bees, the industrious bees, and the predators. Now the reason this matters, it matters for governments, because exactly the same I think is true in governments. Governments can be bees and creative, or they can be extremely effective predators on their citizens, taking their money, their lives, their goods, and so on. But in business, you see a constant sort of struggle between the predators and the creators, the bees and the locusts. And often economic crises happen when the predators become too strong. In the last decade, this happened in finance, where finance, which is meant to be a service for the rest of the economy, like electricity, an input, became all-powerful. They had the biggest towers in every city, their pay went through the roof. By the middle of the last decade, nearly half of all corporate profits in the US were finance, which should never have been the case. And in sector after sector, finance was actually sucking value out of the economy, not putting it back in. And of course, if one part of the economy is sucking value out, it's not surprising you then get crises and crashes. And I showed again and again through history this has happened when the predators have got out of control. And we also showed in our statistical analysis, perhaps more surprisingly, something people know about the predatory excesses of finance, investment in the creative side of capitalism actually shrank and stagnated. Certainly in the US and the UK in the 2000s, investment in innovation stalled and even fell. Companies chose to hoard cash rather than investing in new technologies and new services and new ideas. In this country, they put more money into buildings because they could speculate on them rather than, again, new technologies. So our whole economy globally, at this period when you'd expect there to be a flowering of innovations, in fact, shifted towards the predators and away from the creators. Final point, in a way, follows from that, which is the prescription. I think it's becoming more and more clear that the only coherent economic policies in any part of the world now have to be pretty tough in stopping predatory behavior, whether that's by financial companies, mining companies, or for that matter, some of the big technology companies which are moving from being creators to predators in some cases. You've got to rein that in, otherwise value sucks out of your economy. But you've also got to do much more to invest in really the capacity to generate knowledge and innovation. So I mentioned at the beginning, we've just finished this work on the Chinese innovation system. China is massively increasing its investment in formal R&D, in science and so on. It now has the world's fastest computers are in China. But probably more important is the way they're developing new methods of innovation, often below the radar of sort of big science around manufacturing methods, service methods, web-based methods, and so on. Last year we did a big research study on the Indian innovation system, showing how India was developing innovation methods actually superior to those of Britain, Germany, Silicon Valley, which we actually needed to learn from them and apply them to our own challenges. Often much cheaper methods of innovation, and often to generate cheaper solutions, whether cars, computer tablets, drugs, and so on. But the crucial point, both India and China know that their future economic prosperity depends on a step change in their mobilization of their own citizens' brainpower. And that will need new methods, it needs a bigger share of public spending, not just on education, but on R&D. And above all, this is my final point, which links to where you started, almost everything about innovation economies is about the orchestration of networks. How do you get the knowledge and the ideas to flow between universities and big business and small business and citizens themselves? And even governments, yes. And in many countries you'll have pockets of brilliance, but they're not networked. And so you don't get the value out of them. So a lot of the craft of governance in the next 10 or 20 years is really mobilizing those flows of networks. And this is quite difficult. And again, it's very different from many of the administrative skills kind of I was brought up on. So I started my life as a civil servant in British government, local government, and in Brussels. And this is, I think, why what you're doing is so important, because these are to make people bees and not locusts. The sort of networking collaboration skills, which were things on the margins of government, even 10, 20 years ago, are increasing actually the central skills you need to master.
So the scarcity is related to networks rather than any other.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fine.
Thank you.